Good evening, everyone. Welcome to class session election 2016 on a topic I think that will be of enormous interest to everyone here. We're going to be talking tonight about inequality and opportunity and social mobility. We have three guests who have joined us for the evening, and if you scoured the entire world for some of the experts who are best situated to comment and join us in conversation on this topic, we couldn't have done any better than the folks who are joining us tonight. We're joined by Stanford's own Raj Chetty, who joined the faculty here just within the past year from Harvard University. He is a professor in the econ department here, is a winner of the John Bates Clark Medal, which is awarded by the American Economic Association to the most distinguished economist under the age of 40 on an annual basis. He's also a MacArthur Genius Award winner. We're also joined by Emmanuel Saez, who comes to us from across the bay at Berkeley. He's also in the econ department there. He's partnered with an array of different economists to create some of the most persuasive, convincing evidence about the scope of income and wealth inequality, not merely in the US, but across the world. He too is a winner of the John Bates Clark Medal and also a MacArthur Genius Award winner. Glory Liu is joining us as well. She is not a winner of the John Bates Clark Medal. She is not yet a MacArthur Genius Award winner, but she has won nearly every award there is to win for graduate students at Stanford University. She currently holds the Lieberman Fellowship, which is a university-wide fellowship for advanced PhD candidates. She's completing a dissertation this year on the reception of Adam Smith's ideas in the United States, with a special focus on the 20th century use of the invisible hand metaphor and Adam Smith more generally by the Chicago School of Economics. And not wanting to have an introduction of Raj Chetty and Emmanuel Saez and their enormous distinction overshadow Glory, I should mention that Glory has an award or two that I don't think Raj or Emmanuel has. In addition to her academic distinction, she's an award-winning dancer. So our format for tonight is to have a number of short presentations. This topic, more than any other, lends itself to data. And the economists who have joined us on the stage have been the primary scholars who have assembled some of the most interesting data about inequality and opportunity and social mobility. So we're going to begin with a short overview, a short framing by Jim Steyer. We'll then turn the floor over to Raj Chetty and Emmanuel Saez to present some of their own data. We'll end with a very short presentation by Glory Liu. So we'll have, roughly speaking, 30 minutes of slides to begin the class tonight, and then our usual format, conversation in the chairs. Would you please welcome then Jim Steyer.
Yep. Thank you very much. And it is truly an honor to be here with such distinguished scholars with their medals and awards. And obviously we're going to have a remarkable discussion this evening about inequality, opportunity. Since I have none of those awards or honors, I thought I would start about a story about a recent Giants-Dodgers game. No, unfortunately not the last Tuesday night's Giant debacle. So recently my friend Larry offered me two tickets to a Giants-Dodgers game, and he gave me a choice. He said, you can either sit out in the bleachers with the regular folks, or you can come up and sit with me in the luxury boxes, in the suites where, they have private food, waiters, really good stuff. And you get to hang out in the skybox. And you don't have to rub shoulders with the average fan. And actually, I decided to go sit out in the bleachers with the real fans. And that episode actually helped me frame the theme that I want to introduce this evening at the beginning, which is that I think that skybox experience, in fact, the skyboxification of America is something I want you all to think about in the context of inequality and opportunity. Now, actually, David and I know that we first learned of this from our friend and colleague, Harvard colleague, Michael Sandel, who teaches perhaps the most popular class, Justice, at Harvard. And he sees the skybox effect as being one of the greatest threats to our democracy and to our well-being as a society, even for those of us who sometimes occupy the skyboxes. And I would argue that many of us here tonight are in danger of spending too much time in the skybox. particularly when it comes to issues of inequality and opportunity. And I think we're going to hear some remarkable statistics and data this evening about poverty and inequality in the United States. But I'd ask you to view some of that data through the lens of, say, a 10-year-old boy or girl who lives just a stone's throw away, 2 or 3 miles from here, is growing up in East Palo Alto. You know, for much of the last 15 years, in addition to my role as CEO at Common Sense and as an adjunct professor here, I've taught 1 day a week as a volunteer teacher at an elementary school in first East Oakland and then in the Hunters Point section of San Francisco, Kip Bayview Academy. I started my career as a school teacher. And so I always love to do that as part of my work as an advocate. And at the schools that I've been teaching at or that I've taught at for years, we bring pens and pencils and notebooks to class because the kids don't always have them. There are, as many of you might know, there are crumbling walls, peeling paint, 30 kids to a class, no auditorium, no gymnasium. There are idealistic but overworked and sometimes underqualified teachers. There's no school nurse. There's no sports or music or drama program. And let me give you some of the numbers that I care about that underlie that reality. There are 43 million poor people in America in the year 2015. 1 in 3 of those were children. That's nearly 15 million kids. By the way, children are by far the poorest Americans, by far. Who are the least poor by demographics? Seniors. Only 8.8% of seniors are poor. Now, poverty is defined as an annual income of $24,257 or less for a family of 4. If you are over that, you are not poor by official statistics. That's about $2,000 a month to cover all of your rent, food, all of your expenses for everything. By the way, as the father of a couple of Stanford students, compare that to 1 Stanford tuition is all I can say, which is about $65K and up for 1 tuition. So 24 is the poverty level for a family of 4 now. Now, in 2015, more than 6.5 million American children, that's 1 in 11 children in this country, lived in extreme poverty. So extreme poverty is defined as an annual income of less than half the poverty level, or $12,129 for a family of 4 per year. Imagine living in extreme poverty for a week or a month, let alone for a year. Now, it's also important to remember that more than 70% of poor children in this country had at least 1 family member who works, belying the myth that poor people don't work. Now, African American and Latino children continue to suffer disproportionately from poverty. 1 in 3 black children in this country and 1 in 4 Latino children were poor in 2015, compared to 1 in 8 white kids. Now, although the latest census figures show that poverty remains unacceptably high, they actually significantly understate the number of Californians who are struggling to get by because they don't factor in the increased cost of living. Figures released earlier this fall based on an improved measure show that nearly 8 million Californians, that's 1 in 5 state residents, could not adequately support themselves and their families between 2013 to 2015. California, the Golden State, also stands out as having the highest poverty rate in the nation based on this more accurate measure that includes cost of living. And even more distressing for those of us who live here, children account for nearly 1/3 of all poor Californians. Once again, kids are the poorest of all in the Golden State. To be clear, California has the 6th largest economy of any country in the world, yet we have the 3rd worst standard of living for kids in the entire United States. Today, 1 in 4 kids in the state of California does not have enough to eat. 75%, 3 out of 4, do not receive important health screenings. 1 million children today, under 5, don't have access to licensed childcare. By the way, the last time I checked, 90% of a child's brain develops before the age of 5. And tonight, more than 260,000 California public school students will be homeless. Now, I would just ask, how easy is it to do your homework when you're sleeping in a car at night? So let me tell you a story for a second about some of what my teaching here at Stanford and a thing that I've done many years. It's about a 5th grade student of mine named Kabibi Taylor, who was actually a student at Kip Bayview. She lives with her single mom, very good student. I can never forget her. She has these really cute braids, beautiful smile, the bright eyes that incredibly smart, cool kids have. And for years since I've been teaching here, I always bring about 100 kids a year, first from the school in East Oakland and then from Kip Bayview, to go to college for a day at Stanford. We do it in the spring when the campus is so fabulous. And the idea is you want kids to know what it's like to go to college, to have something to think about, to have something to aspire to. And you know they love Stanford. They just love this campus. And it's become an annual tradition for these fifth graders. They plan on it all year, and when the day comes around for the spring, I rent buses, we load them on buses, they come up right down Campus Drive, and they get out there in front of the old poli-sci building. And the Stanford students meet them and host them for the day. They take them to their classes, show them their dorm rooms, they get to see the athletic facilities, trust me, that's what they love the most. They run around the fountains of White Plaza, they get to see the pool complex, Hoover Tower, then they go to lunch with the Stanford students, and they get a sense of how college can be real and something to strive for. And at the end of the day, all they have to do is go over to Cubberley Auditorium. We always do this ceremony in Cubberley, where they have to get up, remember they're fifth graders, and they have to say who they are, where they're from, and what they want to make of their lives, and what they want to go to, where they want to go to school. They almost always go, I want to be a pro football player, I want to go to Stanford, and after I'm a pro football player, I'll be a doctor. So 11-year-old Kabibi Taylor, fifth grader, comes up, she's standing here at the Cubberley and says, I'd like to read a poem. And I said, fine, that's great. And I'm thinking, you know, Robert Frost, Walt Whitman, this is a good student, so I figure she's going to sort of surprise the audience, maybe a rap poem. So she can barely get her head above the podium, she's sort of like this, and this is the poem she read. It's called Saturday's Child by County Cullen. Summer teethed on a silver spoon, with the stars strung for a rattle. I cut my teeth as the black raccoon for implements of battle. Summer swaddled in silken down and heralded by a star. They swathed my limbs in a sackcloth gown on a night that was black as tar. For some godfather and goddame the opulent fairies be. Dame Poverty gave me my name and pain godfathered me. For I was born on Saturday, bad time for planting a seed, was all my father had to say, and one more mouth to feed. Death cut the strings that gave me life and handed me to sorrow, the only kind of middle wife my folks could beg or borrow. And then she literally walked off of the stage, and everybody just sat there. And some of the Stanford kids started crying. And what could you say? It's hard for me to read the poem. But I ask you, what do you learn from Kabibi and so many other millions of kids like that? How did we get here? And more importantly, how do we change this reality? So I would like to close by briefly framing just 5 key strategies that I think would change that strategy and address some of the data that our extraordinary guests will present tonight. 1, massive investment in early childhood services, quality preschool, childcare, proper health and nutrition for every child birth to 5 in this country. It's insane we do not provide that. A study released this year found that 60% of the socioeconomic status gap among students at age 14 in the US can be attributed to differences already present at school entry, i.e. when they come to kindergarten. 2, a major new commitment to an investment in 21st century K-12 schools. Education is a fundamental right under California's Constitution and historically across the world, the gateway to economic and social mobility. We currently have a 2-tiered education system here in California and in this country. 3, new policies support working families, especially women. For example, paid family leave. You know, for a low-income family without paid sick days, going 3.5 days without wages is the equivalent to losing a month's worth of groceries. Higher minimum wages. It's especially important to have higher minimum wages for women who make up nearly 60% of all minimum wage earners in the state of California, most of whom are sole or co-breadwinners for their families. Quality childcare. 65% of children under age 6 in California have both parents or a single parent in the workforce. The average pay for childcare workers in this state, $10.72 per hour. You know who that's comparable to? Fast food cooks and cashiers at checkout stores. The Earned Income Tax Credit for low and moderate income workers, which encourages work and rewards it. As a next step, and I will probably discuss this tonight, we should also explore bold new ideas like a universal basic income that puts cash into the hands of low-income families. Fourth, economic distribution and redistribution policies from a fiscal and monetary standpoint. I am not even going to get into that when I'm sitting on the stage with Raj Chetty or Emmanuel Saez. They're the smartest in the country on that. But that's the fourth, economic distribution at a fiscal monetary level. And fifth, a major new social and political movement that creates the first ever mass constituency base for children and young people in the United States. The fifth strategy is advocacy and political in nature, and it's, I would suggest, where we all come in. It's what I spend my day job doing at Common Sense, building that base, exploring those policies and trying to improve them, and ultimately building that movement. And I would argue it is doable. We will build it with your help. So I would ask you to frame this discussion and the extraordinary data and presentation you hear this evening with that five-part framework of solutions in mind. And then I would ask you one final question. Isn't it time that all of us got out of the skybox and took responsibility for making this truly a better world of opportunity for every child and young person? Here in the Bay Area, one of the wealthiest areas, in the Golden State of California, here in the wealthiest nation on the face of the earth. Thank you. And now, one of our extraordinary economists, Emmanuel.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you tonight and tell you a little bit about my work on economic growth and inequality. So this is a class about the election. So as we all know, the economic situation plays a big role in voters' decision. Now, when we hear about economic growth in the media, we hear about typically GDP growth, that is how much the economy is growing on average, but that might not be relevant for most people if economic growth is actually unequally distributed. And so individual situations matter, and more broadly than that, people also care directly about inequality because people have a sense of fairness. And the way this is reflected in our society is that effectively we get organized with a government that is going to take about 1/3 of our incomes to spend and redistribute to people through an array of public programs. So the fact that we are willing to share, through the government, a significant fraction of our incomes means that as societies we care about inequality. So tonight I would like to show you a few numbers that we are building. Actually, this is really work in progress that I'm doing with Thomas Piketty and my colleague Gabriel Zuckman at Berkeley, where we want to analyze simultaneously growth and distribution of national income as it comes, from national accounts. And so I'm going to talk tonight about pre-tax income, that is what you get from market activity before any taxes have been taken out and before receiving any government transfers, and then also talk about post-tax income, that is income after taxes and adding back everything that the government redistributes back to you. So here is data showing you the share of total income going to the top 10% of adults, ranked by income since 1917 to 2014. So what you can see there is that this has a big U shape with high levels of income concentration before World War II, with the top 10% taking between 45 and 50% of income, then a big drop at the time of World War II, and then a society that is much more equal in the decades after World War II. And then what is striking on this graph is that starting around the late 70s, a slow and steady rise in income inequality, so that in recent years, we are back pretty much at the level of income concentration that existed before World War II. Now, this is pre-tax income. So if I show you the income concentration post-tax and after transfers, you get the blue chart on this curve. So early on, you have similar levels, pre-tax and post-tax. That's because the government is relatively small. So taxes are low and transfers are also relatively low. So you can see that as government grows, income inequality post-tax becomes substantially lower than pre-tax, so there is progressive taxation and a host of programs that redistribute more towards the bottom than towards the top. And so you can see also a big rise in income inequality in the post-tax series, but less than in the pre-tax. And so on a post-tax basis, the level of inequality today is not as much as it was before, but the key difference is really the size of government, that is taxes and redistribution. Now, when you look at this picture, you might wonder, why should we care about how much the rich are making, what share of the total economic pie they are getting? Shouldn't we care instead of the vast majority, say the bottom 90%? And so the reason why the top matters, it's because it really affects how we interpret overall economic growth. So in this graph, I show you average national income per adult in black since 1946 in real dollars. So you can see that incomes have been multiplied by a factor about 3 as the economy is growing from 20,000 to over 60,000 today. And you can see that growth has slowed down since 1980. It's only 1.4% per year, but still a significant growth. Now, in red, I show you the average income for the bottom 90% adults, so the vast majority of the US population. And what you can see here is that from 1946 to 1980, the path of growth for the bottom 90% is about the same as overall. In other words, in that period, growth is equitable. However, since 1980, you can see that growth is a lot slower for the bottom 90%. Their average income growth per year per adult is only 0.8%, only slightly more than half of the average. So you can see that taking away the top 10% makes a huge difference in the average growth that's going to be experienced by the vast majority of the population. Now, if you go further down and you look at the bottom 50%, that is half of the adult population, the situation is even worse. So you can see on the red curve here, on a pre-tax basis, their real incomes have essentially stagnated since the late 1960s. And this is income that includes everything because it matches up to national income. So it adds, benefits that you may get, if you work, pension contributions. It really tries to be comprehensive. So it's a really striking finding. Now, it's true that on a post-tax basis, they do a little bit better because they've gotten, more transfers, but actually a large fraction of that really comes from transfers to the elderly, with Medicare and Medicaid. For the working age population, the growth, even post-tax, would not be as good. So to put that in contrast, let me show you in this graph the share of income going to the bottom 50% in white here. So the time series shows you that the share of total income pre-tax going to the bottom 50% has fallen from 20% in the 60s, so the bottom 50% was getting 20% of total income, to about 12% today. At the same time, the share of income going to the top 1% has followed, if you want, almost the opposite path, going from about 10% in the 70s up to 20% today. So the reason I wanted to put on the same chart, these two groups, is to show you that the amount of money, as a fraction of national income that the bottom 50% has lost is about the same as what the top 1% has gained. So even though the top 1% is a small group, in terms of people, and the bottom 50% is half the population, the the changes in numbers have been so big that effectively if you took, what the top 1% has gained and gave it back to the bottom 50%, you would essentially, erase the fall in inequality, just to illustrate how much inequality has increased and how much that is concentrated at the top. Now, let me do a break by gender, because as we know, in this election, there's a big gap, in how voters are going to vote, by gender. So in this picture of overall increase in inequality, there's a good thing has happened, which is a reduction in the gender gap inequality. So this is illustrated here by showing you the median labor income for working age men and working age women. So the median is the earnings. Half of the workers earn more, half of the people earn more, half of the people earn less. And so what you can see is that a lot of progress for working age women, they really started from a minuscule number because so many of them actually were not working in the 1960s, and they've come up, to about $20,000 today. The flip side of that is that working age men haven't seen really much progress at all, at least in the median. That is, the median labor income for the working age male in the US, and that includes, benefits and everything. So it's really the comprehensive measure of labor income has been constant over that period. And so that problem of stagnating income becomes particularly salient and striking in bad economic times. So you can see in this graph that during the Great Recession, incomes fell substantially, and they've started recovering, but very slowly, so that today in 2014, you are still substantially below the income in levels, of about 10,000. So that feeling that a lot of people have of not going ahead, really is very salient in the data. So let me conclude by saying a couple things on policy perspectives. The first thing is that people care about inequality because they have strong views on what is fair or unfair. So the reason why inequality numbers have resonated with the public, that it's not just a topic about economic experts, is because people really have views on what is a fair distribution, whether they feel that the economic system works well or is rigged against them. Historically, I've shown you data for the United States, but what is clear in the data is that in the US, income concentration went down at the same time as the role of government in the economy increased, by taxing much more people at the top, regulating the economy more, and developing a series of programs, in particular, education, higher education programs. And that's true for the United States, and that's true for other countries as well, and in particular in the reversal, that is the comeback of inequality that we see in the United States is not a universal phenomenon. That is, other countries have made different policy choices since the 1980s, and they haven't seen the same developments in terms of inequality. So really, my view from all those studies is that inequality is a social problem, and it has to be resolved at the level of society, that is through collective action, through government. However, at the current time, there is a strong public distrust in the ability of government to resolve inequality, certainly so on the right. And so that's going to be a problem, because if you don't trust government, you are not going to vote for policies, that can solve the problem in the first place. So I've also worked on that, and in particular with shown people those numbers, so those inequality series that we've compiled. And so you can see that actually seeing how bad the inequality situation is increases concerns of people, about whether the economy is fair and the economy is going well, but it has very small effects on support for redistribution because of low level of trust in government. So let me stop here, and we can continue discussing later on. Thank you.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here with you this evening. So I'm going to present a different perspective, talk about a different angle on issues of inequality, focusing specifically on opportunity to move up in the income distribution, which I think is really a central aspect of the American dream. So the American dream is a complicated concept that means different things to different people, but to measure it systematically in the data, let's think about one concrete statistic, which is the probability that a child born to parents in the bottom fifth of the income distribution makes the leap to the top fifth of the income distribution. So the classic Horatio-Alger version of the American dream. How common is that in the United States versus some other developed countries around the world where we've assembled comparable data? So in the US, 7.5% of kids who start out in the bottom quintile, start out with parents in the bottom fifth of the income distribution, make the leap to the top fifth. That compares with 9% in the United Kingdom, 11.7% in Denmark, and 13.5% in Canada. Now, sometimes when people see these statistics initially, they react by saying, oh, even in Canada, it doesn't look like your odds of success are all that high, right? Only 13.5%. But you have to remember, of course, that no matter what you do, you can't have more than 20% of people in the top 20%. Or to put it differently, if you had a society where your parents played no role at all in determining your outcomes, we'd expect to see 1/5 of kids move from the bottom 20% to the top 20%. So that's really the most plausible upper bound that you could expect to see. A society with perfect social mobility would have a 20% rate. And so relative to that benchmark, these are actually very large differences in rates of upward mobility across countries. One way I think about it is that your chances of achieving the American dream are almost 2 times higher if you're growing up in Canada than in the United States. Now, these differences across countries have attracted a lot of attention and have generated a lot of concern that the US may no longer be a land of opportunity, contrary to the traditional perception. But there's a limited amount that we can learn as researchers and policymakers from these cross-country comparisons, because there are lots of things that are different about Canada and the United States and Denmark and the US and so forth. So what we've been doing recently with Emmanuel and other colleagues is using newly available big data, large administrative data sets from tax and social security records that allow us to look at these statistics at a much more granular level and understand what's going on in a more precise way in terms of the determinants of upward mobility. So in particular, using data on about 10 million kids who were born between 1980 and 1982 in the US, we construct this map here, which shows you the geography of upward mobility within the United States. And what this map shows is the same statistic that I started out with, the fraction of kids who start out with parents in the bottom quintile of the national income distribution and make it to the top 20%. And the data is broken down by 740 different metro and rural areas in the US. Kids are classified based on where they grow up, and in each of those 740 areas, we compute rates of upward mobility. The map is colored such that lighter colored areas represent areas with higher levels of upward mobility. So you can see, for example, in the center of the country, you have rates of upward mobility that exceed 16%, higher than the numbers we saw for Denmark and for Canada. At the other extreme, you have places like Atlanta, Georgia, and Charlotte, North Carolina, where you have numbers below 4.5%, lower than any country for which we currently have data. So even within America, there's this incredibly broad spectrum in terms of rates of achieving the American dream. There's no one answer to the question of whether the US is really a land of opportunity or not. The answer is really that it seems to depend a whole lot upon where you grow up. So naturally, the question then of interest to us as academics and to policymakers is to understand what's driving this variation across areas and what ultimately we might be able to do at the national level or at the local level in terms of changing policy to improve the situation and increase opportunity for disadvantaged youth. So to take a step in that direction, the first piece of analysis we did is to look at people who move across areas. And I'll just summarize the results of that analysis with this chart here, which gives you an example of people who move from Oakland to San Francisco and looks at how their outcomes change depending upon when they make that move. So actually, let me just step back for a second to set this up and show you local area data here in the Bay Area on the same statistic that I've been talking about, children's chances of reaching the top 20%, starting from the bottom 20%. And what you can see is even within relatively fine geographies, even within the Bay Area, there's substantial differences across counties. So for example, kids who grew up in San Francisco in the 1980s had a remarkably high rate of upward mobility of 18.5%. In contrast, if you go across the Bay Bridge to Alameda County to Oakland, that number falls by nearly a factor of 2 to 11.4%. Okay, so even within relatively narrow geographies, you continue to find really substantial differences in children's outcomes. And so to understand what's going on there, coming back to this chart here, let's think about taking a set of families that move from Oakland to San Francisco and look at how the earnings of those kids look when they become adults, depending upon the age at which they move. So to make this concrete, suppose if you grow up in Oakland from birth, you earn, let's say, $30,000 on average when you're 30 years old. And if you grow up in San Francisco in a low-income family from birth, you earn $40,000 on average when you're 30 years old. What this chart is plotting is what the earnings of the kids who move from Oakland to San Francisco at different ages, starting at age 9, which happens to be the first age we can look at, looks at what their earnings look like. So for instance, the kids who move when they're 9 from Oakland to San Francisco end up about halfway between the kids who grew up in Oakland from birth and the kids who grew up in San Francisco from birth. So they're earning about $35,000 on average. If you move at 10, 11, 12, and so forth, you can see you get less and less of that gain. And if you move in your early 20s or after that point, you get essentially no gain at all. So what you see in this chart is that where you grow up really matters. It's not just that the kids who live in Oakland are different from the kids who live in San Francisco. Apparently, if you take a given child and move that child from Oakland to San Francisco, you see really different outcomes for that child. And I think that's a very encouraging lesson because it shows that you can change environments to meaningfully affect upward mobility. Policy can have an impact. And moreover, what this chart shows you is echoing a lot of what Jim said. This really seems to be about childhood development. The earlier you move to a better environment, the bigger a gain you see. And if you move as an adult, you really don't see much at all. So the question then is, what is the recipe for success? What is it that's different about San Francisco relative to Oakland or the Bay Area in general relative to Atlanta, where we see much lower levels of upward mobility? So let me just briefly summarize to conclude what some of the key factors we've identified are as drivers of these differences in upward mobility across areas. The first links back to what Emmanuel was discussing, which are differences in inequality across places. Inequality and opportunity really seem intertwined in the sense that places that have more inequality, a smaller middle class, tend to also have less opportunity for advancement across generations. So I think when we think about the American dream and think about inequality, we're really talking about two very closely related issues. Second, we find a strong connection with residential segregation. Cities that are more segregated by race or by income, where the poor and the rich are living in really different neighborhoods, they tend to have much lower levels of upward mobility. Perhaps because you have fewer role models or aspirations, as came up in the conversation before, or perhaps because you have less funding for your public schools for lower income families when you live in a more segregated area. Third and fourth are a set of factors that sociologists think a lot about. The stability of family structures, so the fraction of two-parent families in an area, and levels of social capital. To what extent will someone else help you out even if you are not doing well? So Salt Lake City with the Mormon Church is thought to be a classic example of a city with a lot of social capital, and correspondingly is a city with very high levels of upward mobility in our data. So these social factors, the social fabric, seems very strongly associated with these differences as well. And then finally, as you might expect intuitively, places with better public schools have much higher levels of upward mobility. So these 5 factors, you can see how you start to get a sense of what types of policy solutions can really make a difference. I think the key message to take away is that low levels of opportunity in America are not immutable. It's not that throughout the United States we have relatively low chances of climbing the income ladder. There are some places in America where the American dream is well and alive, and I think the policy challenge is to figure out how to replicate that success in other parts of America as well. So I'll stop there.
Through here. All right. So in 2013, President Obama famously called inequality the defining challenge of our time. We're really fortunate to have Professors Saez and Chetty with us today to illustrate the unprecedented scale of that challenge. And I just want to add 2 more points to our discussion today to speak to the question of why inequality is particularly troubling from the standpoint of American democracy. And the first point I want to make is this, that economic inequality is symptomatic of political inequality. A large and growing body of scholarship in recent years has suggested that the democratic ideal of equal representation, equal voice, and equal influence in politics has come under serious fire. And I just want to take a minute to highlight one of the most famous studies that has come up in the last 2 years. So the recent study by political scientists Martin Gilens and Benjamin Page has deserved particular attention and has received a lot of headlines. So Gilens and Page used data from over 1,700 policy initiatives that reached the Congress floor between 1982 and 2002. And what they found was that the chance of a particular policy getting enacted varied dramatically depending on the socioeconomic status of its supporters. So for example, when average Americans, that is, Americans in the 50th income percentile, supported a policy, the policy had just about a 30% chance of being enacted, regardless of the total proportion of people supporting that policy. But things look a little different when you look at economic elites. So when economic elites, that is, people in the 90th percentile of the income distribution, supported a policy, on average it was about a 45% chance that it would get enacted. And that chance would increase as the proportion of economic elites supporting the policy increased. And on the contrary, if the elite opposed a measure, there was just a mere 18% chance that it would get enacted. So their conclusion was that the elite, in effect, exercised a kind of de facto veto. And such findings have inspired these kinds of ominous headlines, that the US is no longer an actual democracy, and that we are in fact an oligarchy. Differences in wealth and status are mirrored in these differences in political responsiveness, which not only carry the possibility of re-entrenching differences in economic standing, but also seriously threaten our claim to being a democratic society that privileges the many rather than the few. And my second point is the following, that economic inequality undermines relational and moral inequality that's fundamental to a democratic society. And what I mean by this is the following. If we take one of the great advantages of living in a democratic society to not only be political equality, but also equality of esteem and relation amongst our fellow citizens, we should be wary of the ways in which vast disparities in wealth threaten our capacity to view and treat one another as equal moral beings. John Adams, our first vice president and later second president of the United States, beautifully captured this idea in a series of lesser-known essays entitled The Discourses on Davila. And he published these essays between 1790 and 1791, right after the First National Bank had been chartered and the nation was on its way towards rapid financialization, commercialization, and eventually industrialization. The historian Luke Mayville wrote in his recent work, John Adams and the Fear of American Oligarchy, that Adams's fear was that wealth would wield influence not on its account of its purchasing power, but on account of its capacity to attract the sympathy of the public. Adams thought this kind of oligarchy would subvert American democracy, not just because the wealthy elite would have political control over the rest of the country, but because their wealth and status would confer them unrivaled social and moral power. Adams describes how riches, quote, attract the attention, consideration, and congratulations of mankind, and that they force the opinion on a man that he is the object of the congratulation of others, and he feels that they attract the complacence of the public. Think of the guy in the skybox that Jim talked to us about. And this sympathy with the rich is accompanied by a neglect and contempt of the poor. The poor man's conscience is clear, Adams writes, yet he is ashamed. Mankind take no notice of him, and he is in as much obscurity as he would be in a garret or cellar. I could go on for days about Adams's moral psychological insights here, but the important thing that I want to draw out is this. The problem with economic inequality isn't just that some people have more than others in terms of political power or economic resources, what political theorists often refer to as distributional outcomes. It's also that economic inequality carries with it a dangerous tendency towards unequal and hierarchical social relations that are antithetical to any commitment to democratic moral equality. When we treat people with more or less respect merely on account of their wealth or poverty, we have failed to treat one another as equals. So, by way of conclusion, I want to raise this question borrowed from Anthony Atkin's recent work. What can be done? Given that inequality is this multifaceted problem that's entangled in questions of democratic responsiveness and also the way in which we choose to view and treat each other in society, where do we even begin thinking about how to address it? How do we go about generating the political, social, and even moral consensus around this idea that inequality is a problem that we should address? It's one thing for many Americans to acknowledge that inequality is widening as a descriptive fact about the world, as this recent Pew study has found. So, according to the study, more than a majority of Americans agree that in the past 10 years, the gap between the rich and everyone else has increased. And that's true across people who identify as Democrats, Republicans, and independents. Yet people are strongly divided over whether or not widening inequality is a problem that the government should do anything about. So a whopping 90% of Democrats agree that the government should do something to reduce the gap between the rich and poor, while a mere 45% of Republicans do. So one question is, what is the reason underlying this problem? Is it, as Professor Saez suggested, a distrust in government? That could be one reason, but I think there's also more. So I hope to have provided just 2 reasons for why we should care about inequality beyond questions about the distribution of wealth. That we should care because inequality undermines democratic processes and also democratic equality. I also hope that bringing together the brightest minds in our nation with the tools and knowledge of economics, history, and political theory, we can better understand, if not begin to address the defining challenge of our time. Thank you.
All right, terrific. You want to start, David?
Well, I want to take issue with you about something, but that's not quite what I mean. I want to dilate on the point with which you began about how this society, like all others, we presume, has some roughly measurable sense of fairness that's built into its institutions and its practices. And you cited the fact that we share 1/3 of our wealth, our income, as indexed or measurable by the share of GDP that goes to taxation. That's at all levels, federal, state, and local, and so on. That's true. However, as you well know, everybody here does, in the OECD, the Organization of Economic and Cooperation and Development family of nations, we're at the very bottom of the scale in terms of the size of our public sector. I think we in Japan are kind of down there at the bottom, and everybody else is up in the 40% range of GDP that goes to the public sector or social capital. So if we take percentage of GDP that goes to taxation, public sector, revenue for public bodies, if that's our index or our proxy for how deep a sense of fairness we have, ours actually looks pretty weak. And it's just a deep cultural factor about this society, and actually it's documentable in various ways back into the 19th century, maybe even earlier. So that's just one observation about the cultural background of this. But then I have a question for all of you. All the data you've shown, both of you showed, show some kind of an inflection point in all these indexes about distribution of income, approximately, give or take, figures around 1980. Now, a lot of people, especially on the left, explain that inflection by Reagan-era tax policies. I, for one, have always found that a pretty weak explanation for the magnitude of the differences we get. So I'd just like to put the question directly to you. Can we segregate out the effect of tax policy on this income distribution matter?
Yeah, so those are very good points. Let me start. So it's true. I talked about the size of government in the US. It's 1/3. In some European countries, it goes all the way to 50%. So France, Scandinavia, as a government, there is 50%, but still, 1/3 is still a lot, sharing 1/3 of our income. So even a society like the United States that has a high tolerance for inequality, where we love, free markets, etc., we still share 1/3, which is a lot. And from an historical perspective, it's also a lot because a century ago, actually, all governments were small, like 10% or less.
In 1929, the eve of the Great Depression, it was 15%.
Yes.
So it's more than double since then, yeah.
Yes. On the inflection point around 1980, I think it's pretty clear in the data, because you can see it in the United States around 1980, in the UK around 1979 when Thatcher gets elected, that something changed. And so you can see all the policies that were taken, so drastic reduction in tax progressivity, but not only that, there are a suite really of policies that were implemented, a continuation of deregulation, policies, trying to reduce the power of the union, so failing, to increase the minimum wage. So it's hard from all of that, to untangle, which aspects matters a lot. I think at the top of the distribution, the very progressive taxes that had existed before 1980 played a role in putting a lid, if you want, on really high compensation. When tax rates were very high at the top, somehow in the bargaining, of how much pay should executive take, that was an important element. It didn't make sense to increase pay at the top if a very large fraction of that was going to go into taxes. Reagan gets elected. He doesn't change only taxes. He also changed the view of society. Now it's okay, to pay, that people who can earn a lot should really try and go and extract as much as they can. And that, brings in the numbers we've seen.
Raj, do you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd agree with all of that. I think the change in the 1980s was probably a combination of tax policies and trends that were maybe further influenced by policy, like changes in educational investments, where traditionally you had technological advancement in the United States that was matched by an increase in the skill level of the population. So humans could sort of compete with machines and, particularly at the lower end of the income distribution, maintain their incomes. But in a really nice book by Larry Katz and Claudia Golden called The Race Between Education and Technology, they point out that starting the later half of the 20th century, especially after the 1980s and so on, partly because of less investment in higher education in the United States, you started to have continued technological advancement, but less investment in education. I think when you have that situation, you naturally have stagnation of wages and a number of the trends that Emmanuel was showing.
The only other thing I think it's worth, I mean, you can ask this, but I'll make it as a comment. I think that culturally we changed in the 1980s. And think about the way that, I was talking mostly about poor people and children tonight, and think about the way that the characterization of poor families and children changed in the 1980s and has never really changed back. So I do think there's this really interesting interplay, and Glory, I think your comments actually brought it up in a sense, which is between when policies change and leaders change, they sometimes affect cultural values, and this is your basic question of fairness, David. But I think this country shifted quite dramatically in that time, and we haven't shifted back. And it includes stigmatization of people of color at times. That's why it's an interesting election right now, because you're getting all these trends are coming together in a rather bizarre way. But I do think there's a cultural factor that has an interplay with both economic change and political change. And your data just makes it clear what happened.
Mentioning the election that's going on, the fact that this is a class on the current election, I want to introduce that element into this big picture discussion that we've been having so far. So of course, we're all familiar with the various allegations that Donald Trump is making these days about the election being rigged. But rather than think about the election itself being rigged, what I want to suggest is that there's an interesting bipartisan view that the economy has been rigged to systematically reward the already advantaged and to, as it were, keep down whether it's the 90% or the 50% of Americans. And some of the data you presented suggests, just as you described, that this wasn't the natural outcome of globalization or a set of economic forces. These were attributable to policy choices that have made. So whether or not rigged introduces a level of, say, human agency to someone diabolically tweaking some knobs in the back of the economic system that you would want to resist, it seems fair to take away from your presentations that either with regard to mobility or to just the distribution of income and wealth, the structural forces that didn't have to be the way that they are generated the lower mobility and the greater inequality that we've seen. And then Glory, of course, introduced in the conversation the effects of this background inequality on the political system, skewing more heavily over the past generation towards the expressed interests of the wealthy. So I wanted to ask whether, when you hear Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders or people on the right like Donald Trump, up to but not including his allegations about the election system itself being rigged, the structural complaint which generates the winners and losers in our economy, you would sign on wholly or at least partially to those allegations. And I do want to ask whether you would wish to use the word rigged in that respect as well.
Permission to speak freely.
I mean, I think, the policy debate or the public debate about the distribution of income is always going to be contentious because people have different views about fairness. And if you think that something is unfair, you can say rigged. You get angry, and that's a natural word, that comes to mind. So it's true that the bottom 50%, in light, of their experience, could say the economy is not working for them. And we see that it's working, for a rarefied set of people. So from that to conclude, the economy is rigged, it makes sense. And I think as well that when we say globalization, it's not a natural force, that falls on the US. It's a choice. Globalization, it's also a choice about how you regulate globalization, because you can do globalization that is allow, US companies to do business abroad through multinationals, but at the same time, do you allow them as well to avoid paying taxes, by parking their profits in tax havens, or do you coordinate with the other countries to make sure, that the extra profits they can make overseas are taxed? And I think there is something true to the fact that perhaps, following the Reagan Revolution of the 1980s, people, the elite tend to see, globalization as more free market, more free reins for businesses, and that tends to favor the top of the distribution. So if you want, the Trump view of the world is that you shouldn't do globalization at all, by putting, big tariffs to prevent, firms from pushing their jobs abroad. As economists, we disagree with that because we learn, that free trade is great. It's great actually, provided that you compensate people who can lose because of trade. And it's true that in the policy debate about trade agreements, etc., that second part, the compensation, how do you make sure that this works for everybody, that everybody ends up benefiting from trade, is often lost, and that can create, resentment.
Yeah.
Can I actually jump in on this? Please. So I think I want to add some complexity to this idea that we can get people to agree that the system is rigged. So there's actually quite a lot of studies out there on public opinion and their perceptions of inequality and whether or not they assign widening inequality to this idea that the system is rigged. And actually the way in which people vary in their opinion depends largely on where they live and how high inequality is in that area. So there's one study that shows, for example, in areas where inequality is very high, people who are at the bottom will say, the system's totally rigged, American meritocracy is just non-existent. People at the top will say, no, the systems work totally fine. Look, I got here. But in counties where inequality is relatively low and social mobility is very high, of course everybody's going to affirm beliefs in American meritocracy and not say that the system is rigged. And so when you try to put that together into some kind of public consensus to say, yes, we can all agree to say the system is rigged and therefore do something about it, I think it's very difficult. So just kind of one other dimension, which is how does public opinion and perception of this issue play into the dynamics of actual inequality?
Yeah, my sense is I think public opinion is greatly shaped by the exposure people have in their own lives. So I think statistics are useful in understanding at a global level what the trends are. But I think for many people, their views about inequality and opportunity are shaped by the experiences they've had, friends they know. Do you have 3 friends who grew up in a low-income family and made it to the top? Or do you have the sense that someone who's working hard is really being rewarded for their efforts? I think that plays a big role. I do completely agree with what Emmanuel said, that a lot of these trends that we see, both in the statistics and people's personal experiences, are shaped by the policy choices we make at the national level in the context of things like globalization and tariffs, but also at the local level. And I think federal policy does a lot to shape local policies. To what extent is the government trying to steer states to have certain type of welfare programs or tax credits for low-income people or support for schools? I think all of that factors into how people feel about the experiences they have and whether they feel the system's rigged or not.
But the one thing I would add is, if you think about the discussion you all had, and then Glory's point about the political inequality, so it's concomitant with some of the economic data that you showed is the evisceration of campaign finance laws in the United States. This started with the seminal case of Buckley v. Vallejo. That is when the floodgates opened. And I think the term rigged, Rob, right? Forget what Trump is, the whiner, is saying. But I thought there was an apt characterization today, by the way. But I do think that you have to look at the context of political equality and the fact that once we remove, after Buckley v. Vallejo, that is the case where everything changed in terms of campaign finance. And therefore, as someone who works in the political realm most of the time, I know what it's like to try to pass early childhood legislation or school reform or whatever, when you run into massive, or Prop 56 on tobacco tax, when the other guys can spend $100 million as they're doing to oppose that. But that happens. So I think it's the interplay of the economic and social inequality that you all are talking about with the political changes that happen that make people think it's rigged. But that's a pretty heavy statement if a large number of Americans think that's true.
Maybe just one more pass at this. So whether or not people in the audience tonight knew the data that you showed, Raj, about Oakland versus San Francisco, let's assume many people knew. And I mean, I'm just glossing what I think your story is. There are a whole bunch of structural conditions that generate the lower mobility in Oakland as compared to San Francisco. And you tried to lay out what a few of them were. And you have data that shows the magnitude of the difference, which is considerable. And of course, it's a couple miles apart. So if upon learning that someone in Oakland thinks to him or herself, well, A, is the implication I should move over to San Francisco? I don't know whether you want to draw that conclusion, but you would have data to show that it might be in their interest to do so. But independent of that, how much are you willing to say about the fairness or unfairness of these background structural conditions in order to give people a reason for, say, political action or just to change their preferences about what they're doing? Or in your role as an economist, are you just presenting the data as you generate it and you let people draw their own conclusions? Are you willing to say the structural conditions, when we see San Francisco and Oakland, something here is unfair? Here are some policies that might be better, fairer.
I think the traditional role economists see themselves in, as scientists looking at these data sets, is to identify the factors that are really driving these differences in opportunity or inequality. And then people can make their judgments about what policies need to be enacted in order to have an impact. I would say in the context of opportunity in particular, while inequality, cited some statistics, can be a divisive issue, there are some people who think we should have more redistribution, some people who think even in the face of growing inequality, that's kind of okay. If you made it to the top, you worked hard and earned that. I think opportunity is a little bit different in the sense that most people think that every kid should have a fair shot at the American dream if if they work hard. There are very few people you'd come by who'd say, no, I think if you're born into poverty, you should persist.
You should stay in poverty.
Should stay in poverty.
Right.
And so from that perspective, I think I would be willing to say that it is unfair that if you're born in Oakland with those structural conditions that I think we could in principle resolve with policy, I think it is unfair that you don't really have the opportunities that we all agree you should have.
Mm-hmm. Emmanuel, you want to add something to that too, or no? Okay.
There's another great field in your field of economics, which is the field that studies economic growth. And we haven't really got that into the conversation yet, but there are some correlations between the performance of the economy on the matrix or the level of growth and distribution. So it's, to my mind, it's not merely coincidence that period when we saw a great compression of wealth and income distribution after World War II also happens to be the longest period of sustained, really high level economic growth in all of American history. It's about 3.7% per year for about 20 some odd years. And your native country, I think, is called les Trente Glorieuses, if I'm not mistaken. So what do you want to say anything about both just the economic and, if possible, the political/cultural correlation between the fact of growth, which has slowed down a lot in this economy in the last generation or two, and the distributional questions?
Yeah, so traditionally people say if you do more redistribution, more taxes, you're going to hurt economic growth. That's the classic conservative argument, and the idea is that if you tax me more, I'm going to work less because the rewards to work, are less. So what does the data say? When you look at the really big picture, actually you see periods of high economic growth, particularly the decades after World War II, that were accompanied actually by a big growth in the size of government. That's true in the United States, and that's true as well in a number of European countries or Japan. So I think what we see is actually a diversity. That is, we have periods of fast economic development associated with a lot of equality, government growth. That's the post-World War II period. But you also have experiences like China since the 1970s, where they are undoubtedly growing extremely fast without really paying much attention, to inequality, and actually with a very high level of inequality. So I think it's a government, it's a society's choice, and there's no obvious relationship between inequality, and growth. Sometimes, too much inequality can hurt you. Sometimes too much equality. If you take, the Soviet experience of perfect, redistribution, at least of capital, that certainly didn't work well for economic growth.
Fair enough, although I've often thought that all societies have the values they can afford. And that in that period, that generation or generation and a half after World War II, this society could afford some very inclusionist and fair values. To me, it's never been a mystery that the 100-year deferred issue of racial equality finally gets some kind of resolution in that historical context. That post-World War II moment when there is very consistent economic growth, reasonably equitable distribution of the benefits of that growth, great national self-confidence, confidence in the future. That's when the civil rights issue finally comes to a head. So maybe the right way around, if to the extent that that's an historical explanation of how we lived through that period, maybe the right way around is to find a way to reignite that growth engine so that we approach those 3+% annual growth rates that we had in those couple of decades.
But I think part of the way of reigniting the growth engine might be tackling issues of inequality. So to give an example of, that I think fleshes out what Emmanuel was saying, that inequality need not come as kind of a trade-off with growth. Think about what most economists think of the modern engine of growth as innovation, right? So people inventing new things like the iPhone or new drugs, et cetera, that improve everyone's lives. And one thing we see in the data is that kids from high-income families are far more likely to become inventors, as measured, for instance, by having a patent, than kids from low-income families. You're 10 times as likely to have a patent if you happen to be born to parents in the top 1% of the income distribution than if you happen to be born to parents at the median of the income distribution. And why do you see that big innovation gap? It's not because of differences in ability or talent so much. It appears to be because of differences in what you're exposed to and resources and childhood environment and things that could be opportunity, things that could be funded through higher taxes perhaps on people at the top, basically combating inequality in various ways. You'd get the next inventor coming through from a low-income family who's going to invent something that will really increase GDP. So I think part of the solution could really come back to inequality, even if we ultimately need to reignite growth.
Let me put on the table a version of a conversation that doesn't come up often in an election discussion, but it seems relevant to bring up here, which is we've talked about the growing rates of inequality, the lower rates of social mobility in the US and across nations. But to the best of my knowledge, and I'm willing to stand corrected here, of course, if you look at global inequality, that's going down. So there are higher rates of domestic inequality over the past generation, while global inequality is diminishing. I'm not sure whether mobility rates and social mobility globally is also going up. Maybe immigration, the standard story is you improve your lot by being able to move to a country of greater opportunity. I guess I wonder whether you think that could or should be a relevant topic of consideration here in a conversation about inequality and opportunity, not just at a domestic level, intra the United States, but if there are benefits globally, I don't know whether they're causally related to growing inequality domestically, how do you weigh that as a relevant topic of consideration? And then if you have a view about how it should count in a domestic election, I'd like to hear that too.
I mean, certainly from a US policy perspective, you can see why people are not focusing a lot or taking a lot of enthusiasm in the fact that global inequality is falling, which I think it is significantly. And my guess would be global social mobility, if we could measure it well, we'd also see that it's increasing over time. I do think from a policy perspective, when we think about America as being a place that attracts talented immigrants, or really the land of opportunity for people coming from other countries, there the global perspective really matters, right? That you need to think about whether the US, given the current trajectory, is going to continue to attract people from other countries, or are they going to want to go to Canada or to Denmark, where your chances of making it might actually be higher. And so that's where I feel like the global aspect should factor into the
domestic conversation. Yeah.
You just remind me of a conversation that I've heard about. I wasn't present, so this is a secondhand report between Xi Jinping and Lee Kuan Yew. And it must have been to the very end of Lee Kuan Yew's life. And Xi Jinping said something to the effect that, China can recruit the next generation of entrepreneurs, innovators, artists, creative people from a population of 1.4 billion people, and that's a real problem for anybody who wants to take us on. To which Lee Kuan Yew is said to have responded, that may be true, but the United States of America, unless it loses its way, can recruit its next generation of innovators, creative artists, innovators, and so on, from about 7.5 billion people, unless it loses its way. We have some evidence right here on this stage.
Yes, that would be true.
Yeah. No, I mean, on that, I wanted to say is that yes, at the global level, inequality is going down, and perhaps what is more important is that the poverty, measured by the classical way, $2 a day has really fallen very sharply because it's been reduced drastically, precisely in countries like China. And I think you should think about that as development. That is, finally, a lot of those very large developing countries are able, to start making technological progress, copying, the most advanced economies. And so that's a big problem in development economics, and it's great that some of those very big countries have succeeded there. But what strikes me is how much, the debate on inequality and what should we do about taxes and transfers is really decided at the national level. So let me again say, in the US, we share 1/3 of our incomes. In European countries, they share 50% of their incomes, but people have a tremendous aversion to giving money to other countries, the least liked government program is actually foreign aid when you do public opinion polls. And we've seen in Europe, the Germans really hated it when they felt like they were giving money to Greece, even though, for themselves, in Germany, they are taxed, like 40% of their income. If a small piece of that goes to another country, you can get people easily,
And they systematically overestimate the amount of any national budget for foreign aid at the same time.
By a big factor.
Yeah.
So can we do a follow-up question? Because this comes from the audience. It's about taxes and tax reform. So they're referring to, Emmanuel, your and your Monsieur Piketty's paper where you said that education reform is cited as one of the possible means for addressing rising income inequality. However, this is the question from the audience. This is followed up by a statement that it would not be sufficient to do that. That you go on to say that tax reform would be a far stronger means of addressing this problem. So the question from the audience is, can you address how you believe that long-standing tax reform can actually be implemented, and if that would be preferable to a tax on wealth? And Raj, it would be great to hear what you think about that too.
Yeah, so again, if you look at the historical perspective, all the countries we've studied, it's very clear that the falls in income concentration are associated with very significant change in the tax system, going from essentially very low levels of taxes, and particularly the progressive taxes, like the income taxes, towards systems that have significant taxes on high income earners. So in a country where income concentration is so high in the United States, it's when you're thinking about the top 1%, or even groups above, the top 1%, education policy is not going to have a drastic impact on that group. So there, the much more direct way is to think about taxation. At the same time, changing taxes on the rich is tough. There are sometimes windows of opportunities. They don't come that often. So for example, if we're talking about this election, if Hillary Clinton is elected but the Congress stays Republican, don't expect to see much action, on taxes. Or if you see some action on taxes, I don't think it's going to be that bad for the top 1%. You really need, at least in the historical record, you need really crises like the Great Depression under the Roosevelt administration, World War II. In the window that Obama had, from 2009, 2010, when he had Congress, Democratic, that wasn't his priority, and as a result, you didn't see a lot of action. But that could have been a window of opportunity when so many people were actually upset, at Wall Street, and it didn't happen. That's why I don't think that much is going to happen.
Our last class session, which you wouldn't know about, was on existential threats to the national security interests of the United States. And perhaps it's overstating it, but just by a little bit, that it might be a welcome development to have an existential threat for the sake of the willingness of the wealthy to be taxed in order to ward it off.
But Raj, what would you do? So because I'm sure you will get called on by whatever administration happens to win if it's on the Clinton side. So what would you recommend them about tax reform? Because that is who you would get called on, and I'll bet you they will call on. What would you recommend?
I think there are two different aspects to the problem when you think about taxes and education. So as Emmanuel said, for the very upper tail, if you want to think about redistribution, it's really about directly, redistributing money through higher taxes. I think what's going on lower down in the income distribution does relate to issues like education and skills where you're having trouble competing with technology or with increased globalization. So one way I think about the problem is, given the concentration of wealth at the very top, even relatively small changes in tax rates will generate a non-trivial amount of revenue, quite a substantial amount of revenue that can be used to fund programs that will increase education levels, provide perhaps better nutrition, expand food stamps programs, develop better affordable housing policies, all of which I think can have really significant impacts at the lower end of the income distribution. So I think the political reality is that it's unlikely you will have massive changes in tax rates at the top, but I think even small changes in tax rates or small efforts to collect more revenue, if spent wisely, can have really meaningful impacts on inequality.
Raj, can we put any even approximate numeric values to that?
Yeah.
Let's say, hypothetically, that we had a new tax reform law and it confiscated 100% of income above $5 million. I mean, I'm picking those numbers out of the air, but maybe you've got better ones. But what are we talking about realistically? How much money is there?
How much revenue is there actually? Emmanuel's a better person to
Yeah,
answer
no,
that.
so actually, there is a lot of money. I mean, you've seen the evolution of the top 1%. If you were to confiscate all their gains, you could make, the share of the bottom 50%, climb back to what it was in the 1960s.
So what are we talking about? $20 billion, $100 billion?
No, it's much more than that. 20% of national income is
on the order of
is something like 1.5 trillion. So 10% of national income is 7,500 billion. So there is potentially some money, and actually I should say, that the Obama administration has started tapping into it significantly in 2013 with the expiration of the Bush tax cuts, the Obama surtax. That increased taxes, on the wealthy significantly and bringing in something, like almost 100 billion extra, per year.
All right, for purposes of argument, let's say it's in the order of $1 trillion a year of tax revenue that could be harvested this way? Is that
well, with the policy of full confiscation.
Of full confiscation. Yeah.
No, that's above a pretty high threshold.
So that's why, this is not realistic, but 100 extra billion per year is something that could be realistic.
Okay, so that's step one. There's real money there. We can put a rough number to it. But then there's step two. How can you have any assurance that that will be invested in the kind of social overhead capital, public goods, that we all seem to agree are the real place where a solution is to be sought?
Yeah, I think that's the critical challenge. If you raise this additional revenue, how exactly are you going to spend that money given many competing demands?
Yeah.
And I would argue that the rates of return are particularly high for some of these childhood investments or trying to improve the skills of the lower end of the income distribution, because I think there, one view is we just have a fixed economic pie and we figure out how to distribute it more equitably. The other approach is to try to increase the size of the economic pie, just to get lower income folks to be earning more themselves, thereby reducing inequality. I think you can leverage your dollar more, given that you only have 100 billion, say. You can get more returns on it by investing it in that way.
But David, I'll give you a California example. So just in the 2016 context alone, so there's Prop 55 on the ballot right now, which is continuing the taxes that Jerry Brown put on in 2012, right? And because they sunset after 5 years. So we almost put a ballot measure on. By the way, the California tax system is really messed up because of Prop 13. We, meaning a few of my friends, my brother, and some other people looked at running a version. No, but let me tell you the numbers. This is why, because it's your question. And we were really focused on the 0 to 5 population, early childhood, because they just get hammered politically. For all the nice things we're talking about and all the data we're talking about, you go try to advocate. Well, Jerry Brown doesn't care about it, that issue. And also you lose because you're going to have to find a revenue source, which is to the point of if you just have a taxation in general as opposed to ballot initiative, you can target where the money goes. But if just adding, I know many of the audience do not like this, but just adding a 1% surcharge to incomes. And again, I'm not saying the income, California's messed up because of Prop 13, but just to the upper incomes of people who made over, I think it was $2.5 billion a year in this state alone, brought us $6 or $7 billion for early childhood. Now you can argue with whether or not that's good social policy, but it was directed money at early 0 to 5, so you didn't have to worry, Raj, that it would be just lost in the general fund. And so the numbers, that's why, David, the numbers are big. But you can't think, since we have been talking about solutions too, you cannot think of tax reform only in the qua tax reform. It's about how do you pay for the investments we're talking about. Because that's the problem. We've starved so many, or we've underinvested in, how about that? So many of the ways that have been proven to raise people in the bottom 50% up. But the numbers are big. The numbers are big in California and across the country. The question is, do you have the political will to do that?
Please, Gloria.
I want to ask one more question from our students. We've talked a lot about different metrics of inequality, whether it's the different shares in wealth or income between the top quintile and the bottom quintile, or the levels of social mobility, or even the levels of poverty in the nation. And these are all different facets of a distribution of income and wealth in our country that people often loosely refer to as inequality. And when we hear inequality in the news headlines, it tends to be a lightning rod issue, right? Like Pew studies will say, do you care about the gap between the rich and poor, and should the government fix it? Everybody's kind of divided. But if you say, hey, should the government do anything to fix poverty? Almost everybody agrees. Of course, we should make sure that people are above a level of sufficiency. Political theorists are very interested in this distinction between, is the gap between the rich and everybody else meaningful if everybody's above a level of sufficiency? And so I've never asked an economist this, but let's say in this ideal great world, everybody in our country is above poverty. Do we still care about this gap between the rich and everybody else, or the differences in social mobility, and why?
Yes, so my emphatic answer is yes. Because in the United States, nobody really is poor according to the World Bank measure. Everybody has more than $2 a day to work with. So even from the perspective of a century ago, our poor people with $22,000 would look really well off. And yet you see here we are tonight, debating inequality, reading Piketty's book, and I predict, that 100 years from now, our societies will be much richer, and they will still be grappling, with the issues of inequality.
Right. So I think one aspect of this is that poverty is not an absolute standard. It's inherently a relative notion relative to what's feasible at that time in the economy. I think another way to look at this is imagine you take the social mobility aspect. Suppose everybody was above the poverty line, but your destiny was always completely determined by your parents. So there was absolutely no mobility at all. It's hard to imagine, even if everyone's above the poverty line, that we would think that that's a good arrangement, right? You want to feel like you're in a dynamic society where you actually have the ability to move up. And so I think inequality and mobility matter above and beyond poverty, absolutely.
So with just a few minutes to go, why don't we take advantage of the brain power here in the room tonight and imagine a scenario in which, the day after the inauguration, whoever wins the election, you're installed as the technocratic economist in chief, and you can, snap your fingers and install a single policy change or two in order to forward the improvements in, or diminishing inequality or improving mobility. What are the most important policy changes to make January 21st?
So let me pick one example. I think there are a number of important areas in which we should be trying to intervene, but one concrete example that doesn't get a lot of attention in the inequality debate is housing policy. Yeah. So in the US, we actually spend a great deal of money at the federal level on housing policy issues in a number of different ways. We have affordable housing programs on which we spend about $45 billion a year. These are things like housing vouchers, public housing projects, tax credits for developers for low-income housing. We also spend $170 billion in a very different way through the mortgage interest deduction, which goes primarily to the high end of the income distribution to homeowners, particularly people in high income tax brackets who get bigger deductions, right? So I think there's a tremendous amount of room for improvement in housing policy in the US when you think of the sum total expenditure over $200 billion a year in a couple of concrete ways. And in fact, we're talking with people in the Housing and Urban Development Agency about exactly these issues. So I pointed out in the context of opportunity that segregation in our cities, residential segregation, is one of the strong predictors of lower levels of social mobility. Housing policy can make a big difference in reducing the amount of segregation in America by having more affordable housing in mixed income neighborhoods, by giving low-income families vouchers to rent houses in neighborhoods outside places with concentrated poverty and limited opportunity, expanding those programs and designing them, importantly, I think, Rob, in a way that for the given amount of expenditure, we're getting more families to move to these higher opportunity areas. There are ways to give families better information about places where their kids will succeed, try to encourage landlords to take on voucher holders as tenants, for example. Various interventions can make these programs much more effective. And how can you fund that sort of expansion? perhaps by scaling back the mortgage interest deduction where we effectively spend an enormous amount of money.
I'm interested to hear you say that, Raj, in part because I don't think I've ever met an economist who says that the mortgage introduction is optimal tax policy, maybe even not rational tax policy. But given the things that Glory's explained, it's almost like a third rail of deduction policy.
Well, but look, realistically, it helped make this a majority homeowner society in the decades after World War II. So I think I heard you say you would cap it at a lower cap. I forget what the cap is now. I think it's 1.5 million.
Well,
mortgage.
Just over $1 million.
So personally, if I were advising you and you're advising the administration, I would say don't do away with it altogether, but lower the cap.
I think that's what, if this is ever tractable, that's the way it would happen.
Emmanuel.
Yeah, so I think, we've talked about the system being rigged, so the first thing I would do regarding tax policy is making sure that everybody pays its fair share. So the US tax system still has a number of loopholes. They've come up in the election
Yes, they have.
Context, and I think it would be, but you have to do it smartly. You were talking about using brain power. The technocrats who really know those things have identified, a number of areas where things could be fixed. And I think also, coming back to the issue of globalization, I think the fact that corporations benefit from globalization but can get away, from paying taxes sends a terrible signal, back in the United States. So I think it's a high priority area, and I think we have the technology. The US could have the leadership to really change this, through example, at a global level.
We have the technology to prevent profits being stashed overseas and left untaxed.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. All right. Next week, we talk about the future of work, and one of the policies that I think will come up is the idea of a universal basic income, another bold policy proposal as Jim described it. In the meantime, would you please join me in thanking our distinguished guests this evening?